Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we dive into an episode that most history books barely mention, but whose implications echo far beyond its time and place. This is the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, a forgotten standoff that raises serious questions about democracy, power, and the role of everyday citizens. And it all started when the heroes of World War II came home, only to find the enemy had taken root in their own backyard. Let's set the stage. It's 1946. The Second World War is finally over. American GIs are returning from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. These men had risked their lives to fight fascism, to defend freedom, and to uphold democratic ideals. But when they got back to places like McMinn County, Tennessee, they found something strange. The America they had fought for wasn't there to greet them. You see, these veterans came home with expectations, reasonable ones. They expected to be able to vote freely, to speak their minds, to participate in a government that respected the rule of law. But in McMinn County, that vision of America was more myth than reality. The region was under the iron grip of a political machine, run by Sheriff Paul Cantrell and propped up by the state Democratic Party. This wasn't just political rivalry or partisanship. This was systemic control. Cantrell's faction manipulated elections, used intimidation tactics, and deputized enforcers like it was a private militia. Think about that. Elections, the cornerstone of a democratic society, reduced to a farce. Votes were bought, stolen, or erased altogether. So imagine the psychological whiplash for these returning soldiers. They had just faced down totalitarianism abroad, only to find their hometown ruled by a sheriff with more unchecked power than some dictators. And that's where our story begins. Let's move on to what happens when legal mechanisms, supposedly built to prevent this kind of abuse, completely fail. Now, here's the question: when democratic institutions are compromised, what recourse do people actually have? In McMinn County, the usual pathways for reform were blocked at every turn. The system wasn't broken accidentally, it had been rigged deliberately. And the more you look at it, the more you realize just how deep the rot went. Let's start with money. The sheriff's department didn't just enforce the law, they profited from it. Deputies were expected to make arrests, not to keep the peace, but to meet quotas. Every arrest meant more fines, more fees, more cash flowing into the machine. It's like turning justice into a business model. And when your revenue depends on punishing people, it's no surprise that punishment becomes the product. Now suppose you wanted to change that, run for office, push for reforms, challenge the corruption. Good luck. Reform efforts were consistently blocked by entrenched power brokers. These weren't just local bullies. They had connections at the state level. They controlled the courts, the judges, even the ballot boxes. Every legal avenue was a dead end. And here's the real kicker: this wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. One political faction had monopolized power so completely that there were no meaningful checks left. No audits, no transparency, no accountability. This is what political monopoly looks like in practice. When one group controls every lever, law enforcement, elections, judicial review, they can operate with near total impunity. And the danger of that kind of control is not just theoretical. It breeds fear, stifles dissent, and slowly erodes the very idea of citizenship. So what do you do when the law no longer protects your rights but actively suppresses them? That's the question the citizens of Athens were forced to answer. And as we'll see next, they didn't just protest, they picked up arms. So what happens when citizens, stripped of every peaceful recourse, decide to take matters into their own hands? In McMinn County, it began with something deceptively hopeful: democracy. A group of World War II veterans, men who had seen combat, who had risked everything for the ideals of liberty, decided to run for office. They didn't come with pitchforks and rifles at first. They came with ballots, with a political slate meant to challenge the Cantrell machine and restore integrity to local government. But the machine didn't blink. On election day, August 1st, 1946, shady tactics were already in full swing. Poll watchers were threatened. Legitimate voters were turned away. And then, most suspiciously, the ballot boxes were hauled off to the county jail, supposedly for safekeeping. Now let me ask you this: why would anyone need armed guards and a fortified jail just to count some votes? The veterans and citizens of Athens weren't buying it. They'd seen too much, and they knew that once those ballots went behind bars, democracy might never see daylight again. That's when the confrontation exploded. Crowds began to form outside the jail. Tensions mounted. Demands for a fair count were met with silence. And then, gunfire. A full-blown firefight erupted between armed citizens and the sheriff's men. These weren't random rebels. These were ordinary people, many of them veterans, who had decided that if the ballot couldn't be protected by law, it would be protected by force. After hours of shooting, smoke, and chaos, the citizens stormed the jail. They recovered the ballot boxes and counted them in full view of the public. And wouldn't you know it, when the votes were actually counted honestly, the veterans had won. It was one of the only times in American history that armed resistance directly led to the restoration of a democratic vote, a moment when the people said, enough is enough. But here's the twist. Was it a lasting victory, or just a flash of justice in a deeply broken system? You might think that after the ballots were counted and the smoke cleared, the story would end with a triumph, a Hollywood finish, democracy restored, corruption defeated. But real history doesn't tie itself up so neatly. Yes, the veterans took office. These weren't career politicians. They were truck drivers, farmers, mechanics, men who had worn uniforms in war and now wore the responsibility of rebuilding local government. And to their credit, they got to work fast. Corrupt deputies were dismissed. Voting processes were cleaned up. Transparency became the goal, not the enemy. For a moment, things looked good, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Because while you can replace officials, fixing systems is a much taller order. Many of the reforms hit roadblocks, not because the new leaders lacked will, but because the structures themselves were warped, shaped by decades of political monopoly and patronage networks. It's like replacing the driver of a wrecked car and expecting it to steer straight without real repairs. Over time, the energy of that citizen-led uprising began to fade. Old power structures, never truly dismantled, began creeping back in. Entrenched interests, wealthy families, political allies, and state-level brokers slowly reasserted themselves. So what does that tell us? It tells us that while grassroots uprisings can spark real change, they rarely fix the root problem alone. Lasting reform requires more than bravery. It requires institutional rethinking, ongoing vigilance, a culture of accountability. The Battle of Athens wasn't a revolution. It was a rebellion, a pulse check on a failing system. And though it scored a short-term win for liberty, it left behind a haunting question. What if the next generation doesn't rise up when corruption returns? Let's go deeper into that by looking at the structural incentives that allowed this kind of corruption to exist in the first place. Let's strip away the drama for a moment and get down to the mechanics, because if we don't understand why the system failed, history is bound to repeat itself. At the heart of McMinn County's corruption wasn't just greed, it was incentive. Misaligned, perverse, and unchecked incentives that made abusing power more profitable than serving the public. Take the sheriff's office. The more arrests they made, the more money they earned. But not in salaries. In cold, hard fees, fines, court costs, jail kickbacks. Law enforcement had become a revenue-generating enterprise. It's as if justice was being auctioned off by the pound. And when power comes with a financial return, that power will be used, whether or not it's just. Then there's the issue of centralized authority. Sheriff Cantrell's machine didn't just control policing. It reached into elections, the courts, the bureaucracy. And when one group holds all the levers of local government, there's no competition, no oversight, no way to check their behavior from the inside. This is how monopolies behave, whether in business or in politics. When you have a single provider of law and order, with no market feedback or institutional accountability, you end up with moral hazard. They could make unjust arrests, manipulate votes, silence dissent, and face zero consequences. Now add in the fact that the system wasn't transparent. Records were hidden. Proceedings were closed. Decisions were made in backrooms and enforced by men with guns and badges who answered to no one but the machine. This wasn't just local corruption. It was a microcosm of what happens when public service becomes a racket and when there's no structural incentive to play fair. And if it happened in McMinn County, how many other places were just like it? So when we talk about the Battle of Athens, we're not just talking about a fight over votes. We're talking about what happens when systems are designed to reward exploitation instead of integrity. Which leads us to a bigger philosophical question. When institutions break down like this, who steps in? What tools do the people have left? This is where things get uncomfortable for both sides of the political spectrum. Because what happened in Athens wasn't just a protest, it was an armed uprising. Citizens, many of them war veterans, used rifles, tactics, and sheer resolve to force accountability from a government that had long abandoned them. So here's the question, was it justified? That depends on how you see the role of the Second Amendment. Is it just about hunting, self-defense? Or is it, at its core, a final safeguard, a last resort against tyranny when every other safeguard fails? For the people of McMinn County, the ballot had been hijacked. The courts were compromised. The police enforced corruption. Every legal channel was closed. And yet, they didn't attack blindly. They acted with purpose, to retrieve stolen ballots, to ensure a fair count, to restore the very democratic process they had sworn to protect. Now, this raises profound ethical and civic questions. When, if ever, is violence acceptable in defense of liberty? What's the difference between a citizen militia and a mob? Between patriots and insurrectionists? The founders of the United States wrote the Second Amendment not as a blank check for violence, but as a deterrent, the reminder that power ultimately belongs to the people, not to the officials who wield it temporarily. The Battle of Athens tests that idea in the real world. And it's worth noting, the veterans didn't try to seize power permanently. They didn't set up a new regime. They counted the votes. They walked away when the job was done. This was not a revolution. It was a reset. And perhaps that's the most provocative lesson of all. Because in a world where centralized systems increasingly manage everything, from elections to enforcement to information, the idea of local, voluntary, citizen-led accountability feels almost radical. But maybe it's not radical. Maybe it's essential. Let's bring this all together in our final reflection. So, what are we really left with after the dust settles in Athens? Is it just another obscure footnote in American history? Or is it a mirror, held up to us across time, asking whether we still understand what liberty actually costs? The Battle of Athens reminds us of something uncomfortable, that freedom isn't automatic. It doesn't renew itself like a subscription. It has to be defended, maintained, and re-earned by every generation. Not always with rifles, but always with vigilance. This wasn't a grand revolution. It was ordinary people, veterans, citizens, neighbors, saying, "We don't need permission to be free. We are the system." And when that system forgets us, we remind it who it serves. And maybe that's the most powerful idea of all. Because in a world increasingly built on centralized authority, surveillance, and regulation, the story of Athens dares to propose something different. That voluntary cooperation, local accountability, and distributed power may be the only real safeguards of freedom. Not everything in this story is comfortable. Not every action was clean. But the deeper truth is clear. A just society can only exist when we the people remain willing to question authority, and when necessary, replace it. Thanks for watching. If you found this episode thought-provoking, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to hear this story in podcast form or explore more episodes like it, check the description for a link to the Truth Behind History podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never forget, history isn't behind us. It's still being written.